defense of the national interest. Paul Saunders, who put this panel together, deserves a lot of credit. When we decided to proceed, we did not know how the title we put together, a new confrontation with question mark, could be shorter, no need for question mark anymore. I think it's pretty clear where we are. And I don't think that many of us would question that we do face a new Cold War. Now, a new Cold War may be in many important respects very different from the old one. First of all, a very different balance of forces. Second, the absence of attractive international ideology on the Russian side. Third, obviously, Russia much more exposed to the West than it was during the original Cold War, but also fewer rules. And I think perhaps more emotions on both sides, and increasingly hostile emotions on both sides. Now, I don't need to tell you in this room that the Russian image in the United States and in the West in general went down dramatically. I think few people understand that there is a mirror image of this situation in Russia. I just came from Moscow. I was there last week, and I was able to witness Russian elections. And I talked to people who support the government, and I talked to people who oppose the government. There was a consensus that an unexpectedly high level of support for Putin, and particularly an expected level of Russian participation in the elections, was connected to what I would call a national security mindset phenomenon. Russian people, the basic Putin constituency, feeling increasingly like Russia was a besieged fortress, were prepared to support their commander-in-chief. You may say, well, Russian elections are not known for being fair and honest. No question about that. But they are not fair and honest in terms of different candidates having an equal opportunity to run, or having an equal access to mass media, in particular, of course, equal access to funding. In terms of just going and voting, that election was fairly straightforward, according to most observers. And one place where it was particularly objective was Moscow, where chairman of the special commission monitoring the election was Alexei Venediktov. Many of you know he is the editor-in-chief of opposition-minded radio station Echo Moskvy. He is a genuine anti-Putin opposition member. And the evaluation was that it was fairly straightforward in terms of vote counting in Moscow, in terms of people having access to polling stations. A shocking result for the opposition. Putin, who in Moscow always had difficulty mastering 50%, now got more than 70%. Got more than 70%. And I was at a party, post-election party for journalists, where a lot of opposition people, candidates, their surrogates were present, and they were all saying, we lost a lot of voters during last days before the election because of this British incident, which most Russians don't believe their country is responsible for, and there was clearly an impulse on the part of many voters to come, get counted, and to support Putin. Even more interesting was the vote of Russians abroad. Most Russians abroad traditionally were not Putin supporters. That's why they lived abroad. And when I was watching on Russian TV long lines of people voting in London, long lives of Russians voting in London. It was clear that these were not just people who worked at the embassy or Russian official organizations. Far too many of them. Well, they got about 80% of Russians voting abroad, and specifically in London, supporting Putin. This is a rather unexpected result for most of us in Washington. It's certainly not a result which anybody in the administration, or particularly in Congress, anticipated. You may say it doesn't have particular consequences, because Putin still has to calculate implications of further sanctions, his normal ruthless caution, his calculating nature, and etc. But we also have a situation when both sides, you have a mindset which makes confrontational moves much easier and justifying accommodation more difficult. Where we will get from these situations and how we came to this situation is an interesting question. I think that we have assembled a first-rate panel with people with a variety of expertise and experience. George Beebe, our new colleague at the center, who is director of our Intelligence and National Security Program, is a career CIA analyst who actually for a number of years served as director of Russian analysis at the agency. And before that, George was national security advisor, focusing particularly on Russia for Vice President Cheney. George, the floor is yours. It is on the record in no more than 10 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to focus briefly on where does Putin go in dealing with the United States and the West more broadly in the wake of the election. And I'm going to offer a fairly simple assertion about how to forecast his behavior. And it's in the form of an equation. Putin's behavior is going to be a function of his political power, his objectives, his intentions, and then the opportunities and pressures created by circumstances. So I want to look at each of those different factors in turn. The first is political power. So the presidential election in Russia was not about choosing who the next president of Russia was going to be. That was obviously chosen in advance of the election. There was no mystery about who was going to be president afterwards. What it really was two things. It was a barometer on Putin's political power, and it was a weather vane, helping us understand where the political winds in Russia are blowing currently. On political power, this was really a good news story for Putin. He essentially achieved that 70-70 sweet spot that the Kremlin had forecast as its goal going into the election. 70% turnout, and Putin winning 70% of that vote. The actual event turned out to be a little over 67% turnout and a little over 76% of voters casting those ballots for Putin. So this sends an important signal to the Russian elite that Putin is popular enough to keep pace with voters' expectations. He's also got enough political power to do something that Russia's political elite really wants him to do, and that's to protect Russia's elite from infighting within the elite itself. Russians at that level want to be protected from each other. They don't trust each other, and they don't trust the institutions of government or the court system to protect them. So they're looking to somebody in the Kremlin to have the gravitas to do that for them. And this was an encouraging signal to them about Putin's power. Not a lot of falsification, and this is also important. The more falsification there is, the more doubt there is within the elite that Putin really has genuine power. The more Russians start to think of themselves as approximating some sort of Central Asian dictatorship, which is not the way they like to look at themselves. So various independent looks at how much falsification there was indicate that this was, by Russian standards, relatively free, if not really fair. It was a tilted electoral playing field, as Dimitri pointed out, but the voting was pretty free. So this tells everybody that the results were probably about right, which is a good sign for Putin from the point of view of his political power. Second thing I want to look at is Putin's objectives, his intentions. What does he want to do? Partly, one of the things we look at there is that weather vane of the elections. What does this tell us about the strength of communist ideology or thought, the so-called national patriot forces, people that are on the right side of the political spectrum who essentially have a nationalist outlook at home and abroad, and what Russians refer to as the radical liberals, people that we would call the liberal Democrats. This was a referendum on their strength, and this was also a relatively good news story from the point of view of Putin. The communists attracted about 12% of the vote. That's not a particularly good showing by historical standards for communists in Russia. So the communist candidate didn't perform as well as the party has typically performed. So this was not a huge blow, but it was not an election that Putin would look at and say, boy, I really better pay attention to that communist agenda as I try to navigate moving forward. Zhirinovsky and Baburin, the National Patriotic Group, also didn't perform particularly well, slightly less than what they've collectively accumulated in past elections. But I think the biggest story on the election, on the weather vane front, was the very poor performance of the liberals. Ksenia Sobchak, who was the standard bearer, I think, more than any other in that area, performed very poorly. And Navalny, who was banned from running altogether and urged his supporters to boycott the election altogether, came out of this looking pretty weak. Not much of a boycott. Turnout was relatively high, and those that did boycott, I think, took votes away from the liberals. So all in all, I think Putin is coming out of this situation looking pretty good. Now the other factor I think to look at in terms of where is Putin going is what has he said? And here I'm going to challenge a little bit of Washington conventional wisdom, which tends to regard Putin as inscrutable, his actions as unpredictable, full of surprises, impossible to forecast. In fact, I think his words have actually been pretty good guides to the things that he's attempted to do over the course of his various terms in office. And what he's telling us, I think, at a big macro strategic level is something that we ought to pay attention to. And this was a big theme in the national address, the so-called State of the Nation address that he gave during the campaign. He's saying that Russia needs to be strong. If I were to boil this down to one sentence, it was, the strong take what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. We don't want to be in the weak category. Russia needs to be strong. It needs to be a strong state. It needs to be a strong economy, a strong society, a strong military power, a strong voice on the international scene. So that's really the course at a macro level that he is charting in the wake of this election. Now, that doesn't tell you how you get there. And the problem with those objectives is that the steps that are required to reach those goals in Russia are all in tension with one another. You want to have a strong economy. Well, that requires actually loosening up that strong state control over society to unleash the creative power, the innovations of businesses and individuals. You can't really get to an economy that is a real competitor in the international scene in commercial markets without loosening up that state. So that's a balancing act that he's going to have to perform, and there's no easy way of doing that. A strong military requires that strong economy. They have a guns versus butter problem. I think Putin is very cognizant of that. And how you square that circle is not going to be an easy thing. Having a strong voice internationally requires having engagement and relations with other great powers in the world. Hard to have that voice if others don't, to some degree, accept that they need to be talking and engaging with you, listening to your positions and interests in the world. But obviously, the situation for Russia right now in the world is far from that situation. So the final factor that I want to focus on is one that I expect that Paul and Michael Kofman will address, and that's the circumstances in which Putin is trying to operate. It's one thing to have power to try to do things, it's another to have objectives that you're trying to pursue, but you've got to do that on a stage where other players are also acting. And there are events that are arising that you've got to contend with. And I think today's news is an example of that. If Putin is going to square these circles to try to make Russia's economy prosper, to try to have a strong voice internationally, he's going to have some kind of a breathing spell, I would say. It's not easy to square those circles if you're doing it within the circumstances of confrontation with Europe and the United States. The greater those tensions are, the stronger the forces pointing toward confrontation, the more difficult it's going to be for Putin to balance those various goals that are in contention right there. And I think what that does is it, in the end, tends to push him more toward the side of the national patriots, emphasizing the military more than the economy, emphasizing greater control as you worry about how the United States and other powers attempt to exploit weaknesses within Russia's economy and society. It forces pursuing that rivalry more than trying to settle it. And it puts a premium on conflict management to make sure that this really doesn't spill out of control. So I'll leave that at that point and address other questions once we get into the Q&A.
Because I want to ask you one question right away. Because when I was in Moscow and this morning I was interviewed by Russian TV Live, so I was able to say whatever I wanted to say. The first question is it possible that the Trump administration really believes that Russia was behind this assassination in Salisbury? And that was a question which was raised by literally anyone I talked to in Moscow, including people extremely critical of the Putin government. And I tried to make a point to them, you don't have to agree with conclusions to understand. It was highly unlikely that Theresa May would call Donald Trump and say, Donald, I want to create a little provocation. Why won't you join forces with me? That clearly some evidence which would be persuasive to the Trump administration and many others was provided. It was not making any impression on the Russians. What do you think could motivate the Russians to do what they did, and how seriously you take available evidence yourself? By that I mean evidence available to you and most of us so far.
Well, I haven't seen much evidence at all. What I've seen is strong grounds for suspicions. And there's a big difference between reasons to have strong suspicions and actual evidence about what happened. The case for the Russian government directing this, for Putin personally ordering this sort of attack on Skripal and his daughter in the UK, essentially amounts to, I want to send a very strong signal both to potential traders and also to the West that I mean business here. And I suppose you could also offer another sort of electoral motivation, that Putin anticipated there would be a strong response, that Russia would be pilloried in the headlines, and that this would cause a rally around the front flag, rally around Putin effect inside Russia, which in fact, as you pointed out, it did. I think that may be giving Putin a little bit too much credit for prognostication about how this would actually play out, and it would be a highly dangerous thing for him to do. And I don't think we've seen the end of this at all. I think this is actually going to spiral.
George, what about something that at least a couple of people in Moscow mentioned to me as a possibility? That Putin gave a green light for all kinds of unsavory behavior vis-a-vis the West, and that there would be semi-private groups that would kind of take this as a mandate to do whatever. So it's like, remember Kissinger used to say, talking about responsibility for Palestinian terrorism, when the Russians were protesting that they were not behind something. Kissinger's response, he was nation's Secretary of State at the time, was, you know, once you start an avalanche, you cannot claim innocence because it was not your particular stone that did it. Do you think that Putin has a general responsibility, or at least possibly has a general responsibility for something like that?
Yes, I think there's no question that he has a general responsibility here, whether he ordered the attack or not. I think he is guilty of presiding over a political system that he essentially created that allowed for the kinds of activities that we've seen here, whether or not he ordered it or not. And we've seen so many of these activities and so many repeated failures on his part to really crack down and prevent this sort of thing, that I think ultimately you have to say, yes, he's responsible at a minimum for presiding over a system that can produce this sort of outcome.
If I could make one comment, and I will just repeat what I told our Russian colleagues in Moscow, and I obviously have no information what exactly happened in Salisbury, but I said, you know, since the Russian government has denied everything, we were at a meeting together with our Russian colleagues this summer, and I tried to tell them that you clearly were misleading everybody about the Olympics. You were misleading about the Malaysian airliner. And at a certain point, when you deny the obvious, people begin to wonder, not only when they can trust you, but they really begin to feel that you are not even concerned about your own credibility. Would you think that Putin is at a minimum responsible for creating that kind of an environment?
Absolutely. I think it's reached the point, especially after the Malaysian airliner downing, the denials of what Russian-backed forces are doing in Donbass, for example, so clearly untruths, that people are beginning to think that a Kremlin denial is actually evidence that they did what they're denying. And that's a very sad state of affairs, and certainly not in Russia's national interest, and Putin bears a lot of responsibility for that.
George, thank you very much. Next we have Michael Kofman, who is research scientist at CNA Corporation, fellow at the Kennan Institute, graduated at the Georgetown University, but these items of his resume do not say what he really is. Michael is one of paramount experts on the Russian military. And in my experience, Michael represents a very present combination of having very hardline instincts vis-a-vis Russia, but then, unusual in this town, being driven by evidence. Michael, thank you very much.
Thanks, I really appreciate it, Dimitri. As Dimitri said in his introduction, my focus here is to talk a bit about the military, but then what I'm going to talk a little bit first is on kind of foundations of power, particularly the military as an instrument of national power as we look out over the next 6 years. But before I start that, George, if there's one area perhaps in the brilliant presentation I may have a nuanced difference, is that I really see sort of the history of Russia as fundamentally a weak great power that often offsets periods of great asymmetry during confrontation with the West, with sort of state-coerced mobilization, as Russia kind of whips itself to catch up, and it uses the confrontation to mobilize itself domestically to make up for clear shortcomings, because typically politically or economically or backward, And so this is, to me, a period that they're going through right now, and somewhat typical of Russian leaders that they think they will use this period of external pressure, the confrontation, in order through domestic mobilization to achieve some kind of modernity, because they clearly always feel behind the West. And then, as long as this period lasts, actually Russia is quite dangerous and quite a capable player, but typically it runs out of air, runs out of breath, and eventually begins to again fall behind, reach a period of stagnation. And there's often debate, well, is that now? Is it later? When does that happen? My personal view is that that is not the period now. That actually, that may come later in the 2020s or early in the 2030s, but there's actually quite a road to go for this rather dangerous period of confrontation with Russia. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that's the case. And I'll talk about some things that will have a sort of wide overriding inertia effect on potentially Russian activity, and particularly the use of military in foreign policy. So, while today Russia's still looking to cut some fat from its military, I want to make it clear that whatever you may think of the Russian economy, and 1.5% of anemic growth is actually more than sufficient to sustain military defense spending at current levels for at least another decade. The defense budget is not only staying pretty strong at 2.8% of GDP, it actually is increasingly looking like there are increases to it. There's a good debate whether or not between late last year and this year, there's been an 8% increase in the Russian defense budget. That's issue one. There's pressure on defense spending, but the reality is they have the money to sustain most of what they need, if not actually have to. Two, number one thing always to watch, Brent crude oil prices. The 3-year budget is based on $40 per barrel. And if you followed the oil price at all over the last year and a half, you've noticed that it's averaging like 55 and it's growing higher every month. It's much higher this year than it was last year. And they're using that money to buy reserves. But when I see a sudden increase in the percentage of the defense budget, I'm not surprised as to where it came from. Right? Oil price is one of the most dangerous things when you're dealing with Russia. If the oil price starts going much higher than the actual budget and defense planning allows for, it really increases the actual national leadership's confidence in what it is they're playing with. Next, state armament program. About 19 trillion, plus 3 for the National Guard and intelligence services, plus 1 for infrastructure, to get around 23. Has about 40%, 30% less of purchasing power that the last state armament program had, but it's still a colossal amount of money, right? The state armament program that basically outlines a strategy for military procurement modernization is more than sufficient to sustain the inertia of Russian military modernization that began in 2011. Size of Russian armed forces finally peaked probably around last year at slightly north of 900,000 altogether. I don't know if they're going to get much higher than that, but the Russian military has been growing year on year until the end of last year, fairly sustainably and steadily. It's a much larger force than it was before, and a much larger percentage of it is now contract share. That is, people who volunteer and sign contracts as opposed to conscripts. And finally, manpower availability. Well, you all know about demographic pressures on Russia. You know that hundreds of thousands of people are leaving the workforce of Russia every year, and that creates economic pressure. What people don't talk about is the fact that manpower availability of people turning age 18 is going to increase every year, starting this year for at least another decade, for very obvious and simple demographic reasons. More people were born in Russia after 1999 every single year, right? All the way maybe through 2013, 2014. So the manpower pool availability only is going to go up for the next decade. So overall, whatever economic pressures Russia's on, what I do not see is I don't actually see it having dramatic effect on Russian military power, military procurement modernization, the manpower availability that they have, the weapons that they're necessarily able to purchase, and a lot of it looks sustainable with cuts here and there, of course, trimming the fat, as there are lots to be found in a military establishment over the coming years. On Russian position in Ukraine, to me, I see mostly inertia. Russia, for a long time, had a large plan to deploy 3 divisions around Ukraine, which is going through, and they're filling them out. Russia's creating 2 new divisions in the North Caucasus now, announced. It's important to understand that the overall Russian vision on Ukraine is to create a very large ground conventional force to deter Ukrainians from thinking that they have any military option to retake the Donbass by force. The second one is to have a force capable of giving Russia a military option against Ukraine. They're going to have to use it. Yes, Ukraine's military today is nothing like it was in 2014. That is very true. Something very important to recognize. Russian military today is nothing like Russian military that fought with Ukrainians in 2014 either. They're actually 2 very different forces. And Russian military has also had change going around like this, as I draw with a pen, after intervention in Ukraine and the campaign in Syria. So it's gotten a lot better, a lot more capable, and a lot larger too. The dominant issue on Ukraine, the Russians look at it as, of course, contact warfare, but I, of course, don't believe that either there's a strong desire in Russia for any kind of military option in Ukraine. So it's a reserve option, nor do I at all agree with people who believe that a deal in Ukraine is in the offing, and that now that this election is over, Vladimir Putin is going to come in and present some kind of condominium to the United States. On the contrary, I think that they are going to relook policy. I think Ukraine is going to, if anything, suffer probably from a much larger unconventional warfare campaign. And on the whole, Russia looks at Ukraine as an area where it has a pretty good medium to long-term gain. That is, from Russian perspective, the costs have been much higher than they thought they would be, but they don't believe that fundamentally this Russian strategy in Ukraine is a failure or that the cause is lost. Syria is principally an area of opportunity. So people think that Russians want to get on Syria. I think they're fundamentally very wrong for a couple of very geopolitical and both bureaucratic reasons. First, Russia see themselves doing quite well in Syria, although now they have to manage a lot of risk in Syria, since Syria is broken up into three distinct conflicts. One between Turks and Kurds, one is the actual, Syrian-Iranian Reconquista campaign that Russia's backing, which is going quite well for them. And the third one's the war they really didn't come for in Syria, which is the conflict between Israel, Iran, and the United States, over increased Iranian military presence and gains made in Syria. That's the one that worries them the most, and is a giant mitigation risk hazard that they're concerned about. But Syria has become the most influential war for Russian armed forces, right? By and large, Syria is the main training pipeline for the Russian Air Force. Syria is the pipeline for all senior officers in Russian military to serve, get promoted, get on medal. They all have to go there and do 3-month stints. So Syria is fundamentally the good war. It is a war where your odds of getting killed are lower than your odds of winning the lottery in Russia. That's the reality of it. You do 3 months, you get promoted. And so in many ways, Syria almost sells itself as both a training ground for the military and an arms expo and basically an operation to test all sorts of weapons. But geopolitically, Russia sees Syria as a great opportunity because that is the one place where it can have regular interactions with the United States. It's one of the few conflict areas where Russian cards are equal, if not better, than the United States, where everywhere else the position is dramatically slanted in terms of power balance against Russia. So like Syria in some respects, because it forces the United States to have this constant interaction with the Russians, where they feel themselves to be equal. Syria also, unlike Ukraine, which is a fixed theater where their somewhat policies run into a ditch, Syria offers good leapfrogging opportunities into other conflict zones in the Middle East, like Libya or Sudan. There are all potential options to establish a power broker role on the cheap, fairly low cost. The permanent basing structure not only allows Russia to expand its role at a low cost, but here's the reality. You can see the response of most Middle Eastern countries. They actually look to Russia now as a possible alternative hedge. In many respects, after the conduct of American foreign policy in the Arab Spring, many countries in the Middle East are looking for any other power that is able to be, even a limited sense of power broker, to hedge, right? And Russians are seizing this advantage and this opportunity for an obvious reason. If the European theater is fixed, and it traditionally was fixed during the Cold War II, the Middle East offers a very effective flanking theater for Russian foreign policy. And there's a lot of sort of pliable ground there in the areas where U.S. policy is floundering, there's no strategy, or American allies fundamentally don't agree with American objectives of policy, which is not uncommon in the Middle East at all. So it presents good opportunities. I'll close out with a little bit on strategy as to how I see wherever you may conceive of as the competition that's unfolding now in the coming years. So to me, the structural nature of the competition fundamentally forces Russia to be increasingly active, right? For a very, very long time, Russia has sought in different ways to create great power condominium with the United States. So it's to get the United States to agree to a settlement to give Russia what it wants. And Russia wants is sort of what traditional, classical Russia's always wanted: privileged sphere of influence, equal voice in international affairs, a voice in European security architecture, buffer states, etc., etc. And we could never get it because in no way was Russia a peer of the United States. The power balance is so fundamentally in the United States' favor, in the favor of America and its allies, that even if the United States was inclined to still do business in that way, which Washington is not, in fact most of Washington doesn't even really do great power politics anymore, it would still not do it and would not agree to it to begin with, right? So since 2014, you can see increasingly a transition of strategy to a different approach, and it's not necessarily a bad one, and that is the strategy of the insurgent and the partisan and international system. Since even though Russia strives for recognition as a great power and for that status, fellow men understand that you have to have some kind of strategy of comparative advantage as the confrontation unfolds. And the strategy is pretty effective. It's a partisan strategy, which is it can be a very capable strategic thorn, the United States side, understanding that the principal adversary to the United States rising and looming is China, and eventually they hope that they make enough trouble, the United States will seek a settlement to make them go away, and they can get some percentage of what it is they want. I'll close out at that because I want to leave time for Paul and don't want to steal away from him.
Michael, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, again, on the basis of things I had in Moscow. Syria. Actually, somebody who is not in the government but is a noted military expert said to me that Russia has to be very careful in Syria because the United States has clearly a vast escalation dominance. And the Russian opinion would not understand a major military engagement in Syria. So he said, unless Russia is directly attacked, Russian planes are down, Russian bases are attacked, he felt that Putin would like to lower Russian profile in Syria. Do you agree or disagree?
Absolutely. In fact, they constantly micromanage their profile in Syria to be the bare minimum that it has to be, right? Why Russian presence in Syria does not exceed 3,500, 4,000 troops and supporting people altogether on the ground, and they constantly rotate equipment, but never fundamentally increase their presence, right? It's because they do want to minimize their exposure. In the sort of game of competitive risk-taking, there are a lot of cases where you see them clearly trying to deleverage and not to make stakes, for example, never coming out and saying that if Syrian forces or Assad forces are attacked, then we will somehow defend them, so as never to be put in the place where their bluff is called. On the other hand, though, you can see that they're quite concerned about a potential U.S. follow-on strike, an expanded strike, due to some chemical weapon used still by the Syrians. And when Gerasimov was told to come out and say, Chief of General Staff of the Russian Federation never comes out and just says stuff. Like, if Dimitri Rogozin or somebody else says something, you can throw it away. It doesn't mean anything. But when Chief of General Staff of Russian Armed Forces says something about politics or makes a particular statement, you have to listen because somebody told him to say it. He says it like this, you know? That's how he says that. So when he said that, look, if there's a larger general strike on Syrian forces, there are a lot of Russian forces and advisors in Syria. If any of them are killed, we will retaliate, not just against the strike itself, but against the platforms from which it's fired. He's clearly raising the stakes. They're obviously putting themselves out there politically to make it clear to the United States in order to limit our own options. So yes, they are exposed, that's true. But whenever considering strike options or any kind of military action in Syria, the United States options in general are always circumscribed by what we think the escalatory risk is with Russia, and they're also good at playing that game and putting out their own political stakes. And we understand quite clear what that message is meant to communicate.
Ukraine, I was told that this is one area where they would really like to compromise on Donbass. Kurt Volker is one American official who really fascinates his counterparts in Moscow because for them Donbass is a no-win situation for them. And if they could find any kind of an attractive solution, meaning saving face and even an informal commitment, no immediate NATO future for Ukraine, that Putin would be inclined to compromise. However, I was told that if the Ukrainians, after getting little weapons and other encouragement, decide to undertake an offensive, exactly as you said, the Russian military is also quite different from what we have seen in 2014. And the way they would fight would not be just in Donbass,
yes,
but going after Kiev, going after airport in Boryspil, using cruise missiles. As I was told, we will give them Baghdad, Belgrade. That will be a kind of experience. Or is this just bravado?
No, it's not. So first, just the conflict hypothetical, Dimitri. Yeah, I mean, the reality is that Ukraine's in a very good position against the Donbass and not in a very good position anywhere else. So if there was ever a larger conflict with Ukraine, it would be incredibly bloody and it would also be incredibly short. And the Ukrainian military would probably be destroyed and lose much of its material within a fairly short period of time. I don't think that Russia has any intention or any plans to march on Kiev. I don't know why it would. It's not that hard to destroy an adversary's military and then force them at gunpoint to sign a political deal. Russia's only done that to Ukraine twice in the last 5 years, and they can do a Minsk 3. But I assure you that Minsk 3, people don't like the way Minsk 2 was written. They definitely don't want to see what Minsk 3 is going to look like if that scenario ever comes about. But if I can answer your question. And I was here when Kurt Volker spoke previously. So much as I like, love, and respect Kurt Volker, I, one, don't believe there's any deal in the offing. Two, I don't believe that Vladimir Putin is looking for a face-saving compromise. There's a weird religion in Washington in any conflict crisis that Russians are looking for an off-ramp, and they really want to leave. And we just need to give them something to leave. And those people are often wrong, but they're never in doubt, Dimitri, because they've been wrong literally every single time they said that about every crisis we've had with Russia, and I'm 100% confident that they're still wrong, all right? Like, no, they're not looking for an off-ramp. Vladimir Putin's not looking to leave, okay? There's not a reality, and there's no, like, can you give me a safe face-saving way out of Donbass? I'm sure they're fascinated with Kurt Volker. I'm sure they tell them that they're fascinated with him. Russians are very good at playing the diplomatic game, all right? There's no easy answers to the Donbass, all right? That's what I'm saying. Please, it's important for people not to be suckers for this kind of thing.
Thank you, Phil.
I offer you realism.
Saunders is Executive Director of the Center. He also runs our Russian program. He is a former State Department official during George W. Bush administration. Travels to Russia frequently, perhaps. With what is happening now, we will travel less frequently, but still has enough contact with Russia to understand their perspective, and you also know Washington.
Right. Thank you, Dimitri. So, since we put this title on the piece of paper for the meeting about the possibility of a new confrontation, and George and Mike talked a little bit about the Russian end of that, let me talk briefly about our end. And I want to try to make 3 points, and hopefully they won't be too disjointed. So, first point is, what is our policy toward Russia right now in the United States? I don't think there's really a clear answer to that question. Certainly we have the president saying repeatedly during the campaign that it would be kind of nice to work together with Russia to defeat ISIS. We have the president on a number of occasions stating very forcefully that having a good relationship with Russia is a good thing, it's not a bad thing. But on the other hand, we have a national security strategy that defines Russia pretty clearly as a revisionist rival. We've got a military buildup. We're putting pressure on our allies to do the same. We're providing arms to Ukraine, somewhat limited, but more than has been done in the past. The president ordered the missile strikes in Syria in the spring last year. So the two pieces don't really hang obviously together, and neither the president really nor anyone else has yet, I think, coherently explained what it is that we're trying to do. On top of that, we have some important personnel changes in the White House that also raise questions about what our policy is and is likely to be going forward. Second point, if we look back at our past policy toward Russia over the post-Soviet period as a whole, it's a disaster. It's been awful. What was our policy? Our policy was that we would kind of integrate Russia into the West. This would be kind of economic, political, and in other ways, and the Russians would kind of converge with our way of doing things. It hasn't happened, but there has been really no meaningful effort to assess why it didn't happen, other than saying, well, Yeltsin and Putin never really wanted that, and we were deluding ourselves. Perhaps that's part of the explanation, but I suspect that there's a lot more to the explanation. Dimitri, in his opening comments, mentioned the unexpectedly high numbers of Russians overseas voting for Putin in the election. If our policy of integration and kind of reaching out to the Russian people were working, we would expect the opposite of that. What Dimitri didn't mention, that there was a good piece by Anton Troyanovsky, the Washington Post's new correspondent in Moscow. He just went to Moscow several months ago. The youth vote for Putin, up, 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 up. That, I think, should also be a flashing red warning light. Our policy, again, was based on the idea that we were kind of creating this attraction, to the young people of Russia and getting them more and more interested in the West, and they were going to change Russia in the future. They're among the people who are most supportive of Putin, in no small part because in their short lifetimes, it's been a period of, generally speaking, prosperity, and of a greater and greater role for Russia in international affairs. Thirdly, we've been trying to put pressure on the Russian economy through sanctions and other measures. The Russian economy, as Mike mentioned, has returned to growth last year, and it's not huge growth. It's around 1.5%, but it's not far off from where Russia was actually prior to the Crimea crisis. They had about 2%, if I'm not mistaken, growth before that. It was already a stagnant economy then, and it's returned to being a stagnant economy now. But it's not an economy on the brink of collapse. Finally, have we seen any real changes in Russia's foreign policy behavior, in response to the pressure that we're trying to put on Moscow? Not particularly. In fact, we're seeing Russia become more assertive rather than less assertive. So, to me, this suggests that we need to take a hard look at our approach to Russia. It may be appropriate to actually take a much tougher line in dealing with Russia. But if we do that, I think we need to think through much more carefully than we have so far how to go about that. Because the ways that we've tried to do it so far, as I said, I think have just really failed. Final point I wanted to make, my third point, relates to this question of foreign influence, which I think has become a big component of the debate surrounding our policy for Russia. And I want to say a couple of things about that. One is, look, it's obvious, I think, that Russia interfered in our election. It's obvious that Russia has tried to interfere in other elections. At the same time, though, I think we need to be a little bit more serious in how we approach a lot of these questions. Not to pick on the Washington Post, I praised their reporting earlier, I'll pick on them a little bit now. There's a big story in the paper now about Cambridge Analytica sending foreign citizens to advise American presidential campaigns. And that's kind of a big deal. Now, I guess we can take the position that that's outrageous foreign interference. The only problem is if we take that position, there were 3 American political consultants who worked for the Yeltsin campaign in 1996 to get Boris Yeltsin reelected. which we have been systematically denying for 20 years, represented any kind of foreign interference in Russia's election. So let's a little bit get our act together in how we think about that problem. Secondly, this reaction that we've had in the United States to Russia's interference, and Dimitri touched on it a little bit. You know, it's really started to appropriately, in some respects, to change the way we think about Russia, but rather dangerously in other respects, to change the way that we think about Russia. And to illustrate what I'm going to mean, what I mean by that, I'm going to give you a short quote. I hope you'll indulge me, from George Washington's farewell address, which some around the table
We have George Washington
know
bust
I'm
in
a great
our office.
fan.
And I want you to know that Paul Saunders even has him in your Twitter address, right?
That's right. That's right. So I'm sorry. So just allow me to give you 5 or 6 sentences. I've abridged it a little bit, but I think it's an important point. Nothing is more essential than that permanent inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachment for others should be excluded. Antipathy in one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes of umbrage, and to be haughty and intractable when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Hence, frequent collisions, obstinate and venomed and bloody contests. The nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. At other times, it makes the animosity of the nation subservient to projects of hostility instigated by pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. The peace, often, sometimes perhaps the liberty of nations, has been the victim. I'm sorry to give you that long quote, but I think Washington, what he lacked in his military generalship, much more made up for in his assessment of human nature. And I think this kind of says it all. We've gotten into a mindset in which anything that happens becomes about Russia and becomes about Putin. And let me just close on one final observation, which I think illustrates in a more concrete way what I'm talking about, although this one relates more to Syria than to Russia. So, last week, the State Department issued a press release, which I don't think got too much attention. But they issued a press release designating a person named Joe Asperman as a specially designated global terrorist under U.S. legislation, and this imposes all kinds of sanctions and other things. Mr. Asperman is a French national, and the U.S. made this designation because, according to the State Department, Mr. Asperman was leading ISIS's efforts in Syria to develop and use chemical weapons, including the use of ISIS chemical weapons on the battlefield. So our position in Syria for 7 years has been that no one other than the Syrian government has the capacity to manufacture and use chemical weapons. And therefore, when chemical weapons are used, it's the result of the Syrian government. And, you know, we need to do something about that. And hence Obama's red line and Trump's missile strikes, which I already mentioned. And believe me, I'm not trying to exculpate Mr. Assad, who I think is more than capable of using chemical weapons, and I'm sure that he probably has on a number of occasions. The point is that here we have kind of clear evidence, actually, that other actors in Syria have the capability to use chemical weapons and have been using them. And that fact has been totally absent from our debate on policy, because everybody hates Assad so much that we don't really care anymore about any of the facts. And that, I think, may have only modest consequences in Syria. But if it leads us down some particular pathways in dealing with Russia, it could be far, far more damaging to the United States and foreign interests.
I have a couple of questions to you, but because we are already fairly advanced in terms of time, I will not raise them now. So the floor is open. I think you have a variety of perspectives. Please. And try to limit yourself to one question or comment, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you for this discussion. My name is Rachel Oswald. I'm with Congressional Quarterly. My question for the panel has to do with the broader context that is happening when, if we can assume Russian complicity with the Salisbury attack, if they underestimated the international response, particularly when it seemed with the election of the Five-Star Movement in Italy that they might this year or next year be close to getting somebody in the EU who would break the unanimity around the sanctions. What does that suggest about strategic thinking in the Kremlin and their potential for miscalculation in a way that could lead to irreversible escalation? Thanks.
George?
You started your question with a very important premise, which was if we can assume that the Kremlin did this. And then what follows is, well, that's a big miscalculation, isn't it? Because this is really and I think the answer is yes. If you assume that the Kremlin directed it, then you would have to assume that they lacked the foresight to anticipate some things which, in retrospect, should have been easily forecastable. And in many ways, this has undermined their position in Europe. I think it has been a force for unification within the EU that has been under a lot of centripetal forces that were serving Russia's interests. So really what you're saying is, hey, they've been trying to divide Europe to their advantage strategically. Things have been going pretty well. Why would they do this? Wouldn't they anticipate this would undermine their interests? And I would agree with that. I think this doesn't make a lot of sense, and your only alternative explanations for this are, boy, they're pretty dumb, and not being able to see what was going to happen here, or you need to look for an alternative to your premise, which is that perhaps this was not a thought-out, Kremlin-directed intentional policy, that some other explanation, such as what Dimitri alluded to, an environment in which you've got some factional infighting within Russia, a lack of control over the behaviors of some forces, and access to chemical agents like this has been allowed to grow, and we're seeing the fruits of that.
Well, then if I could just follow, that would seem...
Let's apologize, but I already have a lot of people on the list. Michael?
Yeah, I'll make a quick add-up point. So, I mean, I personally do assume that the Kremlin was Moscow directed. To me, the easiest, simplest explanation is more often than not the correct one. And that said, though, I think that it was probably about a number of different things, and we're not fully sure yet what it was a message about and to whom on how many levels played out. I will, though, say that as far as I understand Russian perspective, whatever you may think of European Union sanctions, the Russian fundamental philosophical belief is that sanctions will continue to be perpetuated no matter what. The sanctions have nothing to do with Ukraine. Okay, they're about weakening Russia and about Russia's return as power, and essentially sapping their strength. That there's no hope in the Russian government that anybody's going to break any of sanctions. So in some respects, I think from their strategy, European unity is somewhat an irrelevancy. Like, that's not how they actually see this situation, and that can be part of their own weakness of their strategic thought as to how they understand the politics of Europe.
Ambassador.
Just a quick two-part question. First of all,
how will the Russians react and potentially exploit a decision by the administration to leave the JCPOA with Iran? What can we expect from them, and how might they try to exploit it? And related to that, I think I read recently that the president President Trump had a conversation with President Putin, and he sort of debriefed after that conversation. It was very unusual, I thought, what he said. He started talking about trying to do something about the arms race. And that's very un-Trumpian language, to talk about the arms race. And he said, so we agreed that we would talk about the arms race. And then he added, of course, something like, you can be sure that we'd never let anybody acquire as much nuclear capability as we have, of course, but I got the impression that Putin was suggesting some sort of nuclear negotiation with Trump. What's your read on that?
Paul will answer that, but let me just say briefly about the arms control part. I was told in Moscow by the embassy that actually absolutely right, that the question of strategic arms control was earlier raised by Putin, that Trump in a way was responding to Putin's plea to proceed with strategic nuclear arms. That's what I was told. Paul.
He was. He was not.
He was.
Yeah.
That's what I was told.
The press missed that, as far as I know.
Paul.
No, I think obviously we don't know if the administration will pull out of the agreement, and I guess your wife pointed to they won't. If they do make a decision to do that, I think a lot of Russia's response depends on the circumstances. If the Europeans and the Iranians continue to try to adhere to the agreement, the Russians may well calculate that it makes sense themselves to continue to do that too, and to try to isolate the United States, and to avoid things that would kind of obviously upset the Europeans in that context, like big new arms sales or something like that. They may try to stay away from that. But I think it really hinges on how it plays out. Does the U.S. kind of do that after a long period of discussions with the Europeans that just doesn't work, but there's some kind of understanding or agreement to disagree or something, or does it really lead to a rupture, in the U.S. relationship with some of our key partners? Are there secondary sanctions and that whole mess? We'll see.
Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for your thoughts you shared with us. Understatement, Latvian ambassador. Well, my question is about Western policy towards Russia. What we heard today, it looks at the Western policy that was based on assumption that Russian people are not responsible for what Putin is doing, because they are deprived of expressing themselves, they are deprived of influencing this policy. That's what you told us today. Shows that actually this paradigm should be changed. And Russian people are responsible. They are sharing Putin's policy, and they should be treated as responsible for Putin's policy, because they are supporting them. Even in free world, where they are not basically controlled, like London or Riga, well, Riga, 97% of voters supported Putin. That means that this paradigm of separating Putin's policy from Russia's policy, or from Russia, or from Russian people, is wrong. And they should be definitely associated with Putin's policy.
Well, let me be clear. There is a difference between being broadly supportive of Putin's nationalism and being supportive of his specific policies. If his specific policies bring economic disaster or military confrontation, particularly in a place like Syria, I'm not sure that the Russian people would support him. What I was saying is that there is a nationalist syndrome in Russia which is working in Putin's favor. So I would not necessarily say that the Russian people are responsible for Putin. I am saying that Putin, to a large extent, reflects a prevalent political mood in Russia. Paul, what would you say?
Well, I mean, certainly I would agree with what Dimitri said. I think that, you know, if you take the position, and maybe I'm over-interpreting what you said, but if you take the position that the Russian people are kind of complicit in Putin's decisions because they didn't try to vote him out of office, I think in Russia's political context, that's not an easy position to take because, you know, individual people, they have to make their individual decisions about their lives, and the number of people who are willing really to commit their lives and their futures to trying to oust Putin, you know, it's fairly small, and there are reasons for that, you know, because the costs are high, and Putin has seen to it that the costs are high. So I'm, I guess, kind of prepared to accept, as Dimitri said, that the Russian people support the general direction that Putin is going. But, you know, even if you look at a country like the United States, voters, they have a lot of ideas about what general direction they want to go in, but they have very few ideas about what specific policies they want to see, because, you know, that's most people don't have the time or access to enough information, you know, to come up with specific policy recommendations for the governments.
Supported the U.S. Congress during the Tonkin Gulf resolution. Most Americans were in favor of going after Saddam Hussein. It took about 2 years in each case for the public opinion to turn around, and particularly in Russia. I mentioned that I appear on Russian TV live. These are Russian domestic programs. They are prime time. They allow me to say whatever I want. But in the spirit of full disclosure, a limited number of people watch these programs. Many more people watch Russian news. And Russian news, which are watched by many millions, are very carefully orchestrated. So most Russians are not aware of consequences of their government actions. And if they are confronted with these consequences, I'm not sure what the response is going to be. George?
Very quick response. As an analytic point, the idea that we have a Russia problem, not a Putin problem, I think is absolutely correct. The assumption that Putin is somehow far away from the center of political gravity when it comes to dealing with the West is not correct. He's actually in the mainstream and perhaps slightly more pragmatic, one might say, than the center of gravity within Russia as a whole. So if we were to remove Putin from the situation there, the chances are we're not going to see very significant changes in the policies coming out of Russia toward the West.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that probably no matter who you get in without Vladimir Putin, it's going to be maybe 80% Vladimir Putin or 120% Vladimir Putin. But he's a very stereotypical leader for Russia. And fundamentally, the challenge you have today is many policy elites trying to do policy towards Russia today grew up in an anomalous period of 1990s where they thought like maybe that's what Russia should be like, now realizing that's actually a giant anomaly period for Russia. And principally, during the time period of Boris Yeltsin, actually the fundamental difference was that Russia was very weak. Not that the political circles in Russia had a very transformative view of Russia's role in the international system. That might have lasted at best about 4 years tops. So I think that, well, it's different, Dimitri, on particular policy issues, of course, maybe on Ukraine or Syria. You're always going to get a general support for the perception of restoration of Russia's role in international politics and kind of the restoration of pride, power, and dignity and all these things, which are narratives that are constantly sold on Russian television, right? And that can sound pretty easy to manufacture.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. We heard a very... Ambassador of Belgium in Washington. We heard very interesting remarks on the question what Putin might or will do with this reaffirm political power of his. And as this is supposed to be his last term, I wonder whether the panelists could elaborate a bit more or share their assessment on the following question. What will he do with his power regarding his own future position to safeguard that? Second, to possibly identify a successor. And third, to address the significant frustration among the business leadership because of lost opportunities among the business people. So I leave aside what he will do with the young people, because that may be a new element, could also be interesting. Yeah, I had the young people. So thank you very much.
Well, you need to do it in no more than 3 minutes.
All right, I'll try to be very brief. I'm sorry I didn't get it this long. So, you know, when you look at Russian domestic policy over the next 6 years, at least as
Microphone, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, as you look at the next 6 years in Russia and what Putin might be domestically, it seems to me like he has a big problem because what Russia really needs domestically is economic reform, you know, that creates a basis for long-term growth and prosperity and all kinds of other things. The problem is that the main group of people who have specific recommendations how to do that are people who have historically favored integrating with the West. And that option is off the table, at least for the foreseeable future. So all of the sophisticated, well-educated, highly trained economists, financial managers, all of those people, they have very little to contribute in the Russia that actually exists. And I think it puts Putin in a very difficult spot, because either he continues to appoint a number of people like that, as he has in the past, and they continue to fail because they're in a structural situation where they just can't deliver. Or alternatively, he decides that he wants to go in a different direction with Russia's policy. And there are a number of people in Russia who have different ideas about how the economy should work, and they mostly center around state mobilization and state control of the economy and government spending as a driver. I think there's going to be a real temptation for Putin, at least to think about going in that direction, because the other people have very little that they can do.
Okay. Kelly. And then I'm going.
Yeah, so a Scottish businessman, Scott Young, had said that he worried he was going to be assassinated by Russian gangsters, the Russian mafia, and then he fell out of his window and was impaled in 2014, and he had done some work for Boris Berezovsky. Now, I've talked to a writer who's been following this a lot, and he says that's just the iceberg, and there's a lot more cases like that we don't have the evidence for. Do you think that given what's going on right now, they might start to look back at some of these cases and reopen the investigations?
Well, I think probably yes. Whether they uncover evidence in retrospect that was there but not investigated, it remains to be seen. Broader point on this, it's very tempting, I think, to look at patterns and then extrapolate from that and say, well, that's actually evidence that they did it in the case of Skripal. It's not. What it is suspicion that tells you need to investigate and actually look for evidence. We've gotten into trouble on this, and sometimes in the past. There was a media furor a few years ago over a Russian human rights attorney, Yelena Moskalenko, who was involved in defending. Well, she was pursuing a case regarding Anna Politkovskaya, who was a Russian investigative journalist that was killed. She found some mercury in her car and went to the media. Her family got sick, she got sick, they were hospitalized and said, I've been poisoned. Mercury poisoning probably was the Kremlin. They don't like me pursuing these human rights cases. And there, at the time, were a series of editorials and op-ed pieces in newspapers around the world about this outrage and how the Kremlin was clearly behind this. We're seeing a pattern, to their credit, the French police said, hold on, we're investigating. 2 weeks after all this first hit the headlines, they came out with a report and said, you know what? The car that Moskalenko had was a used car. The person that had the car before her was an antiques dealer. Some mercury in one of his antiques spilled. That's what happened. And my point here is not that, gee, that shows that we're all wrong on Skripal. My point is that a pattern does not constitute evidence. It is something that should impel investigation. So in this particular case with Skripal, absolutely we should investigate. We should investigate all these cases. But I think we ought to wait until we actually have evidence before we reach verdicts.
I was in Moscow, as I mentioned, and unfortunately I took a bad fall right in front of the National Hotel in Moscow. As you can see, I'm here in one piece. Two of my Russian contacts gave me an alternative explanation. Both assumed that I was pushed. One assumed that it was definitely done by American intelligence, which wanted to create a provocation in Moscow and to blame it on the Russians. The other said, well, there are clearly people in FSB who resent that you appear on Russian TV defending the United States and still are able to meet with Russian officials. So they wanted to teach you a lesson. I just took a fall. Sometimes things just happen. And
this might be more of a
Ann Guerin, Washington Post. This might be more of a U.S. question than a Russian one, but why do you think the Trump administration was willing to make the bold stroke it did today with the expulsions, and what do you think the next conversation between Trump and Putin will be like?
Well, I have to say, explaining why the Trump administration does things is not a ground to tread on too lightly. It's a difficult challenge. So, in this particular situation, it was clear that there were a number of U.S. allies who were already moving in this direction. Presumably the British government has shared some information with the U.S. government that the U.S. government found persuasive. There's also been already this kind of longer-term desire to be ejecting Russian intelligence operatives and to look for ways to retaliate specifically against that group because of the election interference. So I expect that it just converged. But George, you may have a different view.
I'll caution that I'm speculating here, but I think there are two things that I would cite as drivers. One is domestic politics, and I won't elaborate on that, but I think it makes for good domestic politics right now to take a hard line against the Kremlin. The second thing, though, is the paradigm that we're using to understand the nature of the Russian threat and to prescribe policies that we ought to be adopting in response to that threat. And I'll shorthand this by saying it's the Munich paradigm, World War II and Hitler. When you look at the things that people are saying about Russia and about Putin, there are constant explicit references to Nazi Germany and Hitler. And the worry here is that he has aggressive intentions, that Russia is an expansionist power that will push as far and as fast as it can until it meets resolve and resistance. And that the mistake that we're making here is not pushing back hard enough or fast enough, because the more that we fail to do that, the stronger Russia gets and the greater its appetite for expansion gets. So the prescription is to push back hard, and I think this particular response fits well into that paradigm. However, I don't think we've thought very deeply about it. And I would just offer as food for thought that an alternative paradigm that would produce alternative prescriptions for policy is not World War I, but World War II, but World War I. That's one where we didn't suffer a threat of aggression and expansionist intentions. It was a system dynamic in which misperceptions and mistakes and bumbling produced an escalation spiral that got out of control. And the way you deal with that is much different. If you respond to a situation like that with a kind of anti-Hitler, anti-Munich force, you actually risk increasing that spiral of escalation and having things spin out of your control very quickly. And before we go too far down the Munich response, I think we ought to consider that alternative.
And let me offer you my hopefully somewhat informed speculation. Trump clearly went off reservation last week when he congratulated Putin and did not raise a whole variety of things he was supposed to raise. He found himself in a situation when the allies in Europe were making clear that they would proceed with expulsions of Russian diplomats. If Trump would do nothing under the circumstances, he would look weak at the least opportune moment when he's trying to change his dynamics with the special counsel. My impression also is, from what I was told, that as his staff was not really effective in preparing Trump for his conversation with Putin, this time Trump made himself less than present in deciding how to respond to Salisbury. Last but not least, I understand that this response looks very dramatic. It particularly looks dramatic to diplomats. I'm sure it looks dramatic to people associated with intelligence agencies. A lot of expulsions on both sides. But if we are talking about something that would fundamentally affect the fabric of the relationship, that is not that kind of action. It's not disconnecting Russia from SWIFT. It's not attacking Russian central bank. This is something very symbolic, very visible, but at the same time, something fairly easy to address over time. You replace diplomats and spies with more diplomats and spies, and life goes on. And of course, the Russians will be disappointed that they don't have their listening post in Seattle. Well, life is tough, but that's not cosmic. So I think that at the end, it was a remarkably measured response, even if the process of decision making was not very deliberate.
Yeah, I wasn't glad that when British expelled 23 Russian diplomats with the Skripal case, the Russians had been looking to close the British consulate in St. Petersburg for quite some time. Our Russian colleagues told me that. So they had that card ready and they were looking for the political crisis to do it. The only comment I would add to Dimitri's is that because we're two different systems and we do things differently, would not presume that an equal expulsion of our diplomats and their diplomats is tit for tat and disadvantages us equally. One person may be decidedly the loser in that exchange given equal issues.
And who is it?
Us.
Why?
We looked at George Beebe to say that.
I think we're at a disadvantage in that because the Russians can easily replace their folks. They can operate more easily here with their intelligence officers than we can operate over there. But I think we're the loser when it comes to equal exchanges of our personnel.
You mean their unofficial personnel?
Their unofficial
personnel.
So that's a robust response, but strategically it can also be a very stupid response because every time you do it, you are literally the loser in that interaction every single time.
Okay, Governor Gilbert, then I will ask the same question to all three panelists, and I will ask them to be very brief. It will be a mega question.
Okay, so what are we going to do with these people? They don't want to join the West. economically or politically, because if they do that, they're on a team, a concert of nations led by the United States and the West. They don't want to do that. So are we stuck with a policy of containment to give it, once again, more time, even decades, for there to be an evolution? Or maybe we ought to be trying to find a way to reduce their GDP below $1 trillion and make it very difficult for them to do much of anything. But what do we do with these people at this point, if they're rejecting concert with the West because they think that doesn't make themselves important enough? What do we do?
Well, I think we're getting closer and closer to a situation where containment is probably going to be our best option. I'm concerned that some of the other choices, like, for example, deliberately trying to weaken their economy and driving it below $1 trillion, you know, they'll respond to that. They won't respond to it economically. Their economy is a tenth of the size of our economy. They can't really fight us equally on that terrain. But they'll find another terrain to fight us on.
Okay, meta question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is a U.S.-Russian military confrontation? I'm not talking about nuclear holocaust. I'm talking about a direct U.S.-Russian military confrontation of any sort. Because once we have something like that, how it evolves, nobody really knows. At least I don't. On a scale of 1 to 10.
With 10 being likely.
Well, we stand being certain, and with 1 being very close to impossible. George.
I was naturally.
Boy, I'm glad I'm last.
Hey, George.
I'll go with a 6. I think it's more likely than not, but far from certain. That being said, I think a 6, when you're talking about a military clash between the world's 2 most capable nuclear powers, is an unacceptably high level of risk.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. Some level of confrontation or actually crisis and standoff, I think it's exceedingly likely.
I'm talking about a real confrontation, not just facing each other, but shooting at each other.
Well, I mean, one is the product of the other. These confrontations don't happen as a bolt out of the blue. First you have to have a crisis, and then people make choices, and those choices lead to eventually people shooting each other. Nobody ever gets to a confrontation saying, you know, I have a good idea for Monday, let's do this. It's always a product of, you know, rational choice and spiral decision-making model where everybody makes the best choice, and that's how they end up there. It's incredibly likely. Russians are fairly confident with where they are, and they're really keen to push back, and they have to take increasing steps to sustain the confrontation. People in the United States are very hawkish, and they also want to pressure Russia, push back in different ways, and that's a big self-licking ice cream cone, where basically it's a feedback loop, as it always is, right? We gotta show strength, because Russians respect strength, so we gotta do the strength thing, right? And it just keeps going. 3, people have fairly juvenile sophomore views on great power competition here. In fact, a lot of people don't really understand nuclear strategy and deterrence all that well anymore, and the escalatory dynamics. And you can tell by the conversation that we've been in the terrorism counterinsurgency game for way too long, and people don't really understand what they're playing with at senior levels, and I hear it all the time. I mean, so that's all a recipe for like 1950s, 60s type interaction with another great power where really, you know, I hate to say it, Dimitri, I think it might be a good thing. I think it might actually be a good thing to have that crisis for everybody to grow up.
Give us a number, please. You said a lot, please give us a number.
Give us a number.
Just like lottery numbers, lucky numbers? Yeah, I'd say 6 or 7, sure. Yeah, on a long enough timeline, we're going to get there.
6, 7, Paul?
I'm going to go with 5, actually. I don't think it's more likely than not. But for me, I think it's still an unacceptable risk. It's a very, very... you think it's...
No, he's saying 1.
He says 1. Well, we'll see.
That's what everybody thought. That's what people thought of World War I, too.
Well, I don't think it was optimistic, but hopefully it was instructive and somewhat entertaining. Thank you so much for coming.